Hi, this is Diane Kresh, broadcasting from her home studio to talk about books. This is our first Zoom event with an author, and so just like the author, you never forget your first, I'll probably never forget this. And usually we have live events. We had a big schedule planned this year, We the People, because it's an election year, and we were going to talk about matters of interest to the democracy and social justice, and COVID happened. So this is actually our first event since then, and like everybody else, trying new things, although I do miss the buzz of the crowd and the mingling afterwards and talking about books and all the things that we like about reading and history. The pandemic has brought us to a new place in our history, to be rethinking who we are as a people, how we relate to one another. There have been great things that have emerged. There have been more challenging things, and we'll talk a little bit about those in the interview. But we've also seen enormous generosity and people coming together in community to support one another. In Arlington, my colleagues and I have been part of a great food network, trying to make sure that people in need of food don't go without, that people need rental assistance, people who are unemployed. So it's been a real opportunity to come together and have the government serve in new ways. But as with most things, we'll be writing about this for years to come. And it's always useful to cast the lens of our past to understand both our present and our future. So with that as the backdrop, we wanted to talk about George Washington. And in addition to being the father of our country, what I found most interesting about your book is that you have created a really cheeky portrait of our president. You know, you've gone beyond the marble edifice and you've really humanized him in a way that I didn't expect, and I was really delighted by. So tell me, why Washington, why you? And before you answer, you are Alexis Coe, an author, a researcher, an author of this terrific book, You Never Forget Your First. And so as we start the conversation, again, why you, why now, why Washington, and what about women historians who have somehow been shut out of the men's club of Washington biography?
Ooh, a lot of good questions. I mean, they're fundamental. I grew up on the West Coast. I didn't, as you said earlier before we started, you know, I didn't go to Mount Vernon and Revolutionary War sites as a child. I went to them in graduate school when I was already you know, committed to American history. But I didn't realize that I would write about Washington when I left Mount Vernon that day, you know, in 2008 or 2007. It came over time. I am a political historian, and I dip into the presidents quite often. I host a podcast for Audible called Presidents Are People Too. And the way that I would prepare for each episode, which is, you know, how they teach you in grad school to prepare for an elective. The best advice I can give people if you want to become a quick expert on something is you read 3 or 4 different experts, and then what you hope to have is their voices in your head having a conversation, and you figure out where you come down. Mm-hmm. This works for most presidents. In fact, I would say that this works for literally every president that there is a biography on, because there are a couple that have, you know, just 1 or 2. Chester A. Arthur always gets, you know, a raw deal. But I think the issue for me was when I finished Washington's biographies, I felt farther away from him. And I also felt like there was something so bizarre about the way they all seemed to follow a formula with, you know, differences here and there, page count, where they began, what they were willing to sort of stretch. But it was just like checking boxes. It was very strange. It was almost like they got a writing prompt. And so, you know, and they had this fixation on his manliness, his masculinity, on the battles. And I think that's really interesting. But the reality of being a general, a very important person during the war, is that you're not on the front lines. I'm all for battles when he's younger and he's fighting them. And for the British, by the way, which is a totally different subject, we could all be literally British subjects. But I think that the issue for me is it you know, checking those boxes too, Lexington and Concord. He wasn't there. That was 6 months before he even got close, before he even left Virginia. And so I really wanted to stay as close as possible to him. But the issue was there was this focus on the masculinity, and then really, really tough on women, really tough on his mother, on other people, unless, they were painted as a saint. And the person who came down the hardest was Ron Chernow, who we all know from Hamilton and are very thankful. But, we agree to disagree on a lot of things. And one of them is that he kept saying that Mary Washington's mother was illiterate, for example. And that struck me as really odd as a historian, to really focus on that so much. But then later in the book, he said that she wrote a letter that really embarrassed Washington. And I thought, well, that's really strange, because I'm pretty sure you said she was illiterate 20 times in the first half of the book. So as a historian, I'm going to work this out for myself. So I went and I checked in the archives, and indeed, she was very much literate. She owned books. She wrote letters. She received them with great frequency. And so what that tells me is that she wasn't literate enough, that she wasn't artful in her prose, and that, I knew from books on early American motherhood that this was the way that mothers mothered. Abigail Adams, while uses 1,000 words when there could be probably 50, and we're thankful for them. She also had these very harsh statements she would make about her children, including Quincy, who she called a swan among her geese. But we don't judge her that way. We don't judge Martha, who to me on the page seems rather harsh. And so I began to think about why? And, this was when I had already committed to writing the book, because I knew they got things wrong, but I didn't quite understand, again, why. Why is there no interest in women? And then I wasn't just reading biographies at that point. I was reading everything. I was reading books on his marriage, on slavery, on architecture, you name it. I was on mules. I was into it. I was in deep. And so I moved halfway through, moved my office. And so I decided, what a great moment to refresh my outlook in general. And I reorganized my books, not just here are all my Washington books, but here are all my biographies, here are all my microhistories, like slavery, marriage. And that's when I noticed all men, and not just all men, all white men who wrote biographies. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. And there have been 3 women, including myself, in the last 100 years who have written a biography on Washington. I am the only historian. And in the last 4 decades, I'm the only woman. And I'm not saying this to toot my own horn. I'm saying this because we know in any area of the world that if you only have one group of people with a very specific perspective writing about a topic, they're only going to see certain things. And that is why they parodied each other. They kept relying on each other. They're quoting each other, not often quoting primary sources when it comes to women or people of color. And Washington just hasn't had that yet. Jefferson Studies has from Annette Gordon-Reed, who famously showed us, we don't know what we think we know, and, highlighted things that had been murmurs forever, but that his biographers had overlooked. And so I think that it's less about, being a woman and more about just the need for diversity, not just for diversity's sake, but for the quality of the outcome, which enriches all of us. Because once we really take a hard look at Washington, and this is really the point of it all, right? Once we take a look at Washington and we understand, oh, he's complicated. He's not all great. He's not all terrible either. He's a lot of different things, and a lot of his choices and the way he went around his business and his life, they explain things about our country because he not only founded it, but he was the founding father, meaning that the presidency was built for him. He made so many calls. So much of what he did by example set the tone for everyone for a long time. And so once we start to really look at that, we can see ourselves and our issues, certainly that have been pervasive in the last few years in Virginia and many other states. And I just see it everywhere, right? Like the study of Washington right now is fascinating to me. He hated the Articles of Confederation. before we logged on, I said, I'm an old hand at this. I've been talking about Washington now for a long time, and I've spent years with him. But when you write a book on someone, the relationship changes as the world changes. He's never done for anyone. And so right now we're looking at states fighting over resources, right? They're saying, hey, why is Florida getting more resources than they pay for? Why is New York paying so much more and getting so much less? And that was one of the things that Washington feared with the Articles of Confederation, that everyone would start complaining about these things. And that's why you needed equity and you need federal government.
Right. So let's stop there for a minute.
Yeah.
Because I've decided now to go in a different direction. So if
Okay.
George Washington could time travel, and he arrives here in Washington in 2020, what would he make of institutions that he was very fundamental in founding, politics, partisan politics, states' right versus a strong federal government? Discuss.
Well, it's funny. So as a historian, the question I always sort of dislike the most is, hypothetical situation, right? Because I feel like, it's a lot of me projecting and like putting my own thoughts onto this person who cannot speak for themselves. But Washington, in fact, seems like a mind reader. When you read his farewell address, when he left office, he left the presidency after 2 terms, his choice, so many of his personal choices, again, created the country that we live in the office, the institution of the presidency. So he creates 2 terms, people follow until FDR. But in his farewell address, he said, look, partisanship after 8 years of formal government is out of control. And what it's doing is it's turning politicians who are supposed to serve the people, specific people, white men, it's turning them into power-hungry, greedy people who are either about getting their own agenda done or thwarting the opposition. And that is going to be the downfall of America. And he reminded us why we rebelled against the British. It was because there was no getting through to Parliament. There was no getting through to the Crown, that these institutions had become corrupt and they had fallen into decay as a result. So going off that, so that it doesn't just seem like I'm leaping into it, and what I previously said about the Articles of Confederation, everyone's favorite topic, I think that he would be horrified. I think it would sort of look, I'm imagining he would be an older man. He would be, in his twilight years, because that's just sort of where we left off. So I imagine he would come back. If he came back as a young man, my goodness, I don't know. He would be perhaps picking up arms. He learned over time to control his temper.
Right.
And I think that he would, it would be a bit of grumbling, like a lot of grumbling behind closed doors. We know from the final account of his final 48 hours that he was, one of his last normal conversations that he had with Tobias Lear and Martha before Martha went to bed was Tobias Lear, his secretary, was reading him the newspaper, and he said, oh, Madison and Monroe are really getting ahead in politics. And my interpretation of what Lear said that Mount Vernon has said is correct is he started swearing, and Washington he famously didn't lose his temper as he got older, but I think it's just that he lost it behind closed doors. So he learned to control it. But he would not say that in public. He wouldn't say it in public. So while I think he would be absolutely horrified, I don't know if he would say anything, because he would sort of go, as we see presidents now, once in a while you saw H.W. Bush say something about his party and about Trump in the last few years. But for the most part, even Carter, Carter, sure. Jimmy Carter shows up at the inauguration. He says, this is our job. So he might not say anything, but he will grumble and write a lot of letters, which he would be, more careful of once he figured out the whole internet thing. He was very much opposed to people sharing his personal thoughts. But at the same time, Washington was a reluctant revolutionary until there was no choice. Right. And I sometimes do wonder if we will get to the point where there is no choice, like from Washington's point of view, not from my own, but from his point of view. And so I think it could go one of two ways. He could just do a lot of silent, complaining and be very concerned and sort of say, well, if this is the way we're going to go, we deserve it. and he would wait for other people to do it, or he might just like call for another revolution.
Yeah. I was struck too in that part of the book where you talk about his friendships, the Jefferson, Thomas Paine, James Madison, the bad Jameses, James Monroe.
Yeah,
What
so
they
many
said
Jameses.
before, this is what they said after, and this was the state of the relationship later, and in most cases, estranged. And was that largely a result of disagreements over policy, the Articles of Confederation, Bill of Rights, partisanship? What drove those relationships apart?
The great Doris Kearns Goodwin, a mentor, someone I've worked with on the Washington series, and Blurb the book, she wrote, of course, the wonderful books, but with the greatest title, Team of Rivals.
Right.
And I think that we are often told that the founders were this monolith and they all agreed on everything and they were the best of friends and had very similar backgrounds, and nothing could be more different.
Right.
We think about regional differences now. Washington was a Virginian, and his vice president, John Adams, was from Massachusetts. He was a lawyer. He went to Harvard. Washington stopped going to school around 14. These are Washington owned hundreds of people. Adams owned none. Like, these are significant differences. And then you throw all these people together, just like we see in Congress, and they have very different agendas. And there were times when they were able to work it out, like with the seat of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. That was a great compromise to get the bank. But there were times when they absolutely could not stand each other and felt the way we sometimes feel when we're arguing with someone about politics. Like, I'm done with you. I never want to speak to you again. There were people who found a way back to each other. Famously, I think famously, maybe not for, I think there have been books written on it, but Jefferson and Adams in their dying days exchanged letters, and like that was the last thing they said. Those were their last words. Washington, to me, when he was done with someone, meaning that they didn't have a purpose the way Thomas Paine did during the Revolution, or they had done something that so hurt him because he really was injured by things. He was very sensitive. Done. Just absolutely strange. And that's why I did that, is I really wanted to hit home these two columns. The book is narrative, but there are these charts and things where I say, like, look, this is what they said about him before, which was absolutely perfect. It was sort of like, say what you will about your feelings about Barack Obama. When he took office, even his supporters were very worried about the hopes and dreams put on him. And, he won the Nobel Prize, et cetera. Like, how could someone live up to that? And Washington was a little bit presented like that. Like, in the end, he, when he proved to have poor judgment, as everyone does at certain times, or when he made mistakes, or he didn't side with someone, they said something about him that was disparaging. He wasn't. He had issues. He was human. Everyone did, but he did. He was harsh when it was over in ways that you don't see with every founding father.
Yeah, that's what one of the most remarkable things about the book is that you really do humanize him. He owned slaves. He famously hunted down a couple of slaves who managed to escape from his ownership. He was a little bit cranky about his pay that he would get on occasion, particularly in the military. So he's not this perfect edifice. I grew up on the Parson Weems stories, talking about the cherry tree, and he threw the silver dollar across the Delaware. And the only one did he really truly kneel in the snow at Valley Forge, though? Is that, who knows?
Probably not.
Probably not.
It's highly unlikely. Parson Weems, who you mentioned, is this great itinerant minister, as far as a great name and a great ability to push a book. Like, we could all study him, right? He promised his publisher that it was going to sell like flax seeds. That was, they're still kind of expensive at the health food store, but they were super expensive back then. And he delivered. He was the first to market, as they say. And he gave America was a baby, right? So Washington used to call America an infant empire, which I always think is like a little bit sweet. And also we should think of him less as a father and more like a mother, because I really do think that he birthed the nation, and then he carried the baby to term, and then he was like, oh no, I've got to raise this child. I can't just send it off to boarding school and hope that it does well, you know. I think that you know, Parson Weems saw a real desire to have American stories based on morals and values that we believed ourselves to have, but we couldn't keep using the British Empire's stories. We needed our own. And who better to be a vehicle for that than our first hero, our first in war, first in peace. And he was very built up after he died, certainly, and with good reason. You know, he did the unthinkable. What's interesting though is that those stories stayed, but the stories around him changed. Like going back to his mother, at first she was painted as this absolute saint because that's how American mothers should be. That's the story we wanted. And then that changed over time. But the cherry tree, the hatchet, you know, all those things somehow keep living on, even though they're not even in the books anymore. And I think a part of it is that people say it. And then we take these giant leaps. Like, how did we go from that to, like, even Parson Weems didn't go as far as wooden teeth. And I think we haven't been taught since Weems set the tone, we just haven't been taught to think critically about Washington. And a bunch of it is fear, right? There's fear around, and certainly in the last, 4 or so years, this has nothing to do with Trump. This has to do with monuments, right? We've all heard about these debates around monuments, and and that, you know, well, whose story are they telling? When were they brought? When were they built? Who are they for? Who are they against? And they're very divisive. And I think that is, there's this fear that you take down the monument, you take down the person. And with Washington, there's absolutely no taking him down. Like, he is, as I said in the beginning, he's ingrained in our culture and in our being and in our country. There's no canceling him. And so there's no need to protect him and say, well, you know, today you would be put in jail for slavery. Sure, he's not alive today. That's not the standard that we should be judging him by, but we should be judging him by the standards of his time. So if we're talking about something like slavery and you say, well, he didn't really understand, he absolutely did. And we know that from the archives. So let's just take him at his word. He spent a lot of time debating that issue with a lot of different people.
Right. But it does almost still seem like sacrilege to say anything against Washington. And what I enjoyed about your book was the balance. Yes, there were these complications. And yes, he did learn to control his temper. He appeared to have a very loving relationship with his wife. And Martha, when I was a kid growing up, the fact that Washington married this widow, I always imagined Martha to be like 10 or 20 years older than Washington.
The bonnet. It's the bonnet.
I don't know. Or the way she's depicted in portraiture, there's the famous picture in the National Gallery of the Washington family, and she looks very matronly in the gray hair, and the older children. And so I wouldn't say it's affectionate necessarily, but it's certainly more of a relationship, a 40-year bond between the two of them. And one of our readers asked about most of the correspondence, I believe you said, was destroyed between the two of them. What remained, and how were you able to write about and to understand the relationship and the bond that they held?
So you find this in early America a lot, that there are couples who burn their letters. And sometimes it's because, you know, the musical Hamilton made it seem like it was just about Hamilton's affair, and that's why Eliza burned them. You know, she would have, I think the burning actually happened at the end of Hamilton's life, not in the throes of this scandal. But I think, you know, it was fairly common, and it was quite clear from Martha that she didn't want to give the country anymore. She didn't attend the funeral. She was always, when she would write to other people, which is how I constructed some of this, you know, she never wanted to go and socialize and play this part. It was exhausting. And she even says at one point, which I found so revealing and just so truthful. And I don't mean like, oh, she hated being a first lady. I just mean like, it was really hard, and it was okay to say that. One point, Washington is off being president. He's got to tour some states, and he really enjoys it because he likes checking out industry. And she's home, and she's like, this isn't fair. I have to hold these salons. I hate them. I have to talk to a bunch of people. I feel like turn around and say something negative about us. And that's okay. As far as their relationship, there were a few letters found in the back of a desk, which is always really exciting. And then we just piece things together. Like, we know that he had a case of dysentery, and that's why he, was in her neighborhood. And she had everything that he had been looking for in other women. And we know that because we have all these letters to their father saying, hey, I would love to marry your rich daughter. And they were like, thanks. You don't have a whole lot to offer. You 27-year-old upstart who has, who rents from his sister-in-law. So, but we do know that Martha had choices galore, right? And this was something I really wanted to take a pause at and really focus on their marriage, because we do think of them as older always. And what it seems to me happened, because Martha was a widow, it's true, but she was a young widow. She had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And by all accounts, she was pretty hot, right? She's often described as buxom. There are lots of men chasing after her, lots of people, good and bad choices. But her previous husband was a couple decades older.
Right.
And my feeling was that if she was going to marry, because she was in this unique position, she had total control over the estates. I think if she was going to marry, it was going to be for love. And here's Washington, same age, super hot, well-known, taller than everyone else, clearly very charismatic and athlete. And within months, they're planning to get married. And so it's just very clear that, like, they fell in love. They fell in love fast and hard. And the rest of their marriage, well, we don't know what they said to each other, except once in a while that he called her Patsy. That was like a huge revelation. But we do know that whenever they were apart, like when he was, fighting this war, that he did everything to get her to come out to be with him during the winter months when it was cold. Like, he wanted her around, and she struggled because she was scared. And also she liked Virginia, and she was raising children and children and children. And so I think it was just very clear to me from piecing together all these things, like, it's not a perfect, they're not a perfect couple, but there's love there. Absolutely.
Right. Well, you really succeeded in making it real. So Martha is buxom, and he's got great thighs. Okay. So they're an amazing looking couple. And yet,
and they cut it up on the dance floor. We know that.
Well, there you go. And yet, there's an amazing catalog of maladies that he suffered, some of them repeatedly. And again, that list that you presented in the book is sort of staggering. I mean, any few of them would have felled a lesser person. So,
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the maladies and the state of medicine at the time, and what was it about him that he was able to persevere?
The worst thing someone could do for you in early America was call a doctor when you were sick. It was really just best to wait it out, because they had bad information, good intentions, but there just wasn't a lot that could be done for you. And there was a lot that could hurt you that we know now does hurt you, like mercury, for example. What is amazing about Washington is he's not only exceptional for the era, but he's exceptional for his family. The men in his family died very young. His mother lived into her 70s, which is just remarkable. And Washington, as I've said, he was a great athlete, but like anyone else during his time period, was incredibly vulnerable to diseases. And he started contracting them very early on. The amount of times that he had river fever, malaria, countless, throughout his life. And the big one, though, was smallpox. And he contracted that the one time he left the country, he only left once. And that immunity that he got when he was a young man, served him quite well in the war, and helped us win the revolution, because had he not insisted that the soldiers be inoculated, which the British government had outlawed in America with good reason, it gave us an advantage. It's unlikely we would have won the war. And he only sent the initial troops. Boston was the site of the first skirmishes. He only sent troops that had been inoculated in 1,500. He was willing to go with pretty lean numbers in order to make sure that they wouldn't just die from disease. So I think that this all predates germ theory. And what he did was, every time he survived something, he wasn't reckless, but he did sort of take notes, and he thought, okay, this is what this feels like. This is what helps. And I'm going to sort of live like this could happen again, and I may or may not survive it. Like, he was always ready to die, which I always found really interesting, but always ready to survive as well. The treatments were awful. I mean, it was always just some sort of expunging, or you were bled, you were blistered, you were, anything to get the toxins out. And
by whatever means necessary.
Yeah. And it wasn't pretty. And the symptoms were always like the amount of times this man had the bloody flux was truly incredible, which is another word for dysentery, but it's really something to see it over and over and over again. And so those charts that I have in the book, I made those for myself, because I did feel like, okay, we're always told he's too marble, blah, 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 but I kept seeing these really human things, and I really did want to appreciate how exceptional he was when he was being exceptional, in every sense, wonderful and bad. And so I started making this list for myself, and then I thought, oh, this is too good to deny my readers. And I think that is a good way to look at his body. His past biographers, because they were sort of obsessed with his masculinity, they sometimes spent a lot of time just describing his body in a way that, like, I don't often see in presidential biographies, but I have seen in romance novels. They would talk about his thighs, and they would talk about like Chernow talks about how his muscles rippled through his jaw, and all these things that seem like, sir, this is, take it in the other room. This is not appropriate.
Right.
And so I think that is a major difference, but I do think his body was undeniably amazing in all that it survived, and what it, like, the respect and the presence he must have had. We struggle, they would spend so long, his biographers, talking about his thighs and like how amazing his body was, but all we need to really hear is that he was charismatic. He did just attract people the way you see anyone, like an athlete or a famous person. It's not just that they have the smartest thing to say or they're the loudest. He was neither of those things. But he had that thing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the charisma.
Mm-hmm.
And just riffing again, Washington, you mentioned Hamilton. So Washington in popular culture. Did you like Hamilton? Did you think it was uneven? What did you think about the portrayal of I guess it was Jefferson and Washington were key in the story. So just what are your thoughts about that?
The musical was amazing. It was so much fun. My favorite Washington is in Turn, which is I would say a middling to bad TV series I love. It's all about Washington's spies. It's really fun. It's like when bad, it's fun. Hamilton is not that thing. That's not at all how I would describe it. It's incredible. The excitement that Lin-Manuel Miranda was able to inspire in people who were not inclined to care about early American history, and who didn't really know who Hamilton was, because he died. He was murdered or killed. He was sort of complicit in it. But the problem with Hamilton that every historian worth their salt has said is that by replacing all of the founders and the supporting roles with people of color, you took away from the fact that there wasn't representation of enslaved people who were definitely all around those people at all times.
Right.
And you sort of like, you did a service and you did a disservice. And so that was a little bit of, that was my only issue. Otherwise, I have to say I listened to it all the time. The soundtrack, when I would, you know, need to get out of my head and need to get out of like all these tones and sort of remember that like this is fun and you can be serious and accurate as a historian, which is not something that Miranda is and doesn't have to adhere to those things. This is a creative work. But you can make things fun, and I felt very inspired by it. And I think that all historians really did. There were a few who just absolutely rejected it fully. You know, it didn't have as many naysayers as, like, let's say the New York Times 1619 project.
All right. So riffing again, there's a movie that was made in the 40s, George Washington Slept Here. Have you ever seen it?
No, I've heard about it though.
Amazing. Jack Benny and Ann Sheridan, and it's based on a Kaufman and Hart play. It's just sort of silly. But I did some reading about it, and one of the things, and you can maybe dispel or agree, is this idea that Washington traveled so much, he didn't have a house, and he often stayed in inns and private homes. And this phrase, Washington slept here, so you ride through these little towns and you see this sign hanging in front of a country inn, and you are immediately swept along, ooh, this is historic. So fact or fiction?
Well, first of all, Washington had a home, several homes actually. He owned his mother's home. He inherited it when he was 11. She was holding on to it for him because that's the way it works in early America. And then he rented and then owned, because his half-brother died and then his wife died and then their daughter died, Mount Vernon. And he owned that he basically lived there from his late 20s on. So he absolutely owned home. And then he owned land in tons of places, including DC. And as we learned from his will, that's when we're like, oh, he's rich. No one really understood how rich he was until then. He did, however, spend the night at places. And this is really interesting. Washington didn't want to owe people favors. He felt like if you stayed at their house and you accepted their hospitality and you didn't know them that well, that they might come around and or they might spend the whole night just hammering. And he hated small talk. He hated that sort of thing. He liked socializing, but only if you really meant it. And so on the way, for example, to his inauguration, which took a long time because it took a long time to travel and because everyone wanted to stop and celebrate him, the great hero of the revolution, now going to lead the country and be this president. He spent the night in a lot of places, but he would not accept any free nights, any free stays, any free meals, to the point where he had to take out a loan because he was rich, but like many Virginians at the time who were, as we call them, planters, you know, slave masters owned plantations, he was cash poor. But he was land rich and he was not willing to part with it. He would rather take out a loan and like pay it back when he could than sell any of that precious land. Even though his children, who were Martha's children biologically, were definitely set up, but he wanted to leave holdings to his other descendants. They weren't immediate though.
So what in writing this biography whet your appetite for? Are you ready for another sort of upended treatment of another founding father? Are you going in a completely different direction? Like what's on the horizon?
You know, I'm not sure. Life is, for us all, thrown us a bit of a curveball, and I was still supposed to be on tour. And so I'm home, a couple months early, and the archives are all closed. So I do have some inklings here and there, but I don't quite know. I think that I find this entire era so fascinating. I really don't think that we understand it at all. And I think it's both more fun and more interesting than it has been made to seem. So I'm not quite sure, the last 5 years of my life between the book and the History Channel series, which I produced along with Doris Kearns Goodwin, and I also appear in, that was my life, and it was all Washington all the time. My husband has only known me with Washington, which is pretty funny. So I'm sort of learning what it's like, but I am poking around a lot. I am looking at a few, I won't say which ones, but I am looking at a few related stories. And I'm just so eager for the archives to open up, because I don't just want to tell a story to tell a story. I need to know what I'm doing, and I need to feel compelled, like, oh, they've all gotten this wrong. So I have some suspicions, and stay tuned.
So it sounds like you almost enjoy the research and the digging in even more than, okay, all right.
100%. I don't know any writer who really likes writing. There's very, very rare, there are always these like very navel-gazy essays in the New Yorker about how writing is so miserable and why do we do it, and it really is the worst, but also fun and challenging, blah, blah, blah. But there's nothing more fun than researching, because researching is sleuthing. And I wonder if this is true for your library, and I think this is why people get into genealogy and other things. It's the same thing. You're a detective, and local history is like the most fun thing, and it's never bite-sized. People always think it's going to be bite-sized, and it never is. So yes, of course, I love research. I love turning the page. I love getting to the end of the folders. And even though I'm there because the person died, and I know that, and they've been dead for hundreds of years, I always get so sad. When I was writing the last chapters of Washington, when he dies, I was really in it. Like, I also think that it was darkly funny the way that he died. He just kept insisting on being bled. He was like tough man through the end. But I was really sad. I was in the way you mourn someone because at that point he was so real to me. I was sad that I was distressed that he was suffering so much, and I was sad he didn't get to do certain things and he didn't follow through on certain things, and I was so proud of him for what he had accomplished. It was really like I was sitting there with I was next to my grandparents when they died. It felt so similar to that, to really like
I can't imagine being that close to a subject and then having to say goodbye. And it's a challenge. I love the way you wrote about his end. I die hard, and the bleeding, and the last words. You want to talk a little bit about that last scene?
Yeah, I think people often talk about how his death was agonizing and it was brutal and went on, but they don't really show us it. And we have all these great letters from Tobias Lear, who at that point was not only a secretary, but had married into the family. And so he's there the whole time. And he wrote he obviously took notes, and he also wrote several different letters to people with slightly different versions, but not anything that you really need to complain about. Just like interesting. When we tell a story, it changes. And to me, it was just like true Washington. He it figures he has a few years left to live. He's left the White House 2 terms, trying not to look at politics, but like still very much getting worked up about, Monroe and Madison and Jefferson and all of those Democratic Republicans, because the big reveal is he is a Federalist, right? He believes in strong central government. And he goes out to survey his land because he is a micromanager. Absolutely. And the weather's bad. He comes home after 5 hours of this, and he's soaked through, but he's late for dinner, and he doesn't want to do that. He's a polite man, and he didn't want to keep Martha waiting, and so he had dinner in wet clothes. And Tobias Lear, by the way, is like, and I knew he was going to get sick at that moment. And there's a lot of, like I told you, so there's something to be written about all the presidents who have died from wearing wet jackets. Famously, the
William Henry Harrison.
Who only served to 30. He also shook everyone's hand. So maybe there's something there too. Different time for us to discuss that. But so then he still insists on going out because he is this micromanager, and there are trees to be felled, and of course no one else can mark them but him. So he goes out, he's sick. And he'll later say he knew this was going to be the end of him from the beginning, and so he just kept going. That's what I mean about this sort of controlled recklessness, this responsible recklessness, if such a thing exists. And then he wakes up, and it's like 3 a.m, and he can't breathe, and he has what we think is epiglottis. He's sick, but he's like particularly sick around his throat, and he won't let Martha call a doctor because she's just gotten over a cold, and it's cold out, and he wants to wait until the enslaved people come and light the fire. And then all these doctors are called. But basically, at Washington's demand, he is constantly bled. And even Tobias Lear, and that's what I mean. I just had to show you everything that I saw in these archives, because Tobias Lear is like, listen, man, the blood is barely coming out at this point. It is like glop, glop, glop. You know, it's not like, oh, you're cut and like it's gushing and you don't know what to do. It is barely coming out because there's barely any left. And that's how it works with platelets. It gets very thick. And so that keeps happening. So it shows us so much about him and sort of how he approached everything. Just sort of went all in, thought he was either going to survive it by going very extreme or not survive it by going very extreme. And he was kind of always at peace with those outcomes, whether it was taking on the most powerful nation in the world or being, bled a ton. Martha can't take it. She goes to her room, which was just a dressing room, but she would never sleep in their shared room again. And the fact that they shared a room was another indication that they loved each other. It wasn't a requirement at the time, unless, one was trying to have children. And he tells her to bring 2 wills. And I'm not sure that Martha even knew that he had 2 wills. He had a lawyer make one up a decade before. And then he wrote one that summer. He died in December. So this is just a few months old by the time he finishes it. And the difference is, we think, because one was burned, but we know from the lawyers, notes that the difference is he emancipated his slaves. Huge caveat, not outright. One man outright, the rest based on Martha's discretion or her death. And even then it gets complicated because their slaves married each other and had children, and her slaves were always going to her heirs. That was part of being married before. And then he just sort of apologizes to everyone. And he says, I'm really sorry, but I think we're all done here and you can go home. Don't stress. It's fine. And they all all the doctors write each other letters like, did we do the best we could? I think we did. And he then in the last minute shows something he really didn't before, which is fear. And I mean before, like, his entire life. He tells Lear to come real close. He says, like, do not bury me until I have been dead, by your estimation, for many days, at least 5. And Lear's like, okay, sure. And Washington, in my imagination, because Lear says he kept repeating, like, grabs Lear, brings him close, and says, no, I'm being serious. Do not bury me. And this was something that all the Washingtons I later learned had fear of. And then he's gone. He says, 'tis well to Martha. And then it's it. And Martha repeats it. And Washington died. And it was just... what a scene. I mean, he couldn't have gone, he said, I go hard. And that's something that, like, when I was a teenager, people said about drinking a lot, when I was in college and such. And that's like, he went hard, There's no other way. He died hard.
Well, it's just a very poignant scene. And I wanted to close the Washington part of the conversation. We've only got a couple of minutes left. But as I noted at the beginning, we're living in an unusual time. With the virus and the stay-at-home orders and the questions about what life will be like when we begin to open our doors again. And I'm just wondering, as a historian, are you giving any thought, like, are you keeping a daily journal? Life in COVID 2020, you have a family, you have a daughter. I mean, are these things that you're thinking about, not because you want to immediately put pen to paper, but for the future so that you can have the memories with you?
I think we should all be recording it to the best of our ability. This is a strange moment for us because we're all living lives that we've been told specifically are unhealthy and not good for society. And so I think that there are days that people have good days and they can be recording, and they should, because not only for their families and themselves, but for historians who will perhaps study it. We don't know how this is going to end. Right. I have tried inconsistently. I do have a baby. She's 10 months old. And a husband, we're both trying to work with no childcare, all of a sudden. So it's a little bit different. She has coronavirus. And so you know, I have been trying to take little notes, but honestly, the days are so full, and she's the happiest baby in the world, but a little bit scary with the temp. So basically my notes usually have to do with her temperature. And I think that that is enough. And often many famous people in history have just written down. Joan didn't even, you know, and I've looked at so many archives, so many calendars where they just write what they ate, what they did, who they saw, and how they felt. Right. And it's illuminating. You don't have to go on, which I tend to do when I sit down to journal. But I do think it's important to, yes, absolutely, to record our experiences. Some of it will be recorded because don't forget your emails and your texts and all of that.
And your tweets.
And your tweets, my God.
And your tweets will live on.
Yeah, and that, so I would actually encourage people to write something because it's your only line of defense, right? For people like me.
It is an unusual time, and I agree that in many ways holding it close helps us be better in the future, I think. There are some silver linings about how we're behaving toward one another. There are some negatives too, but I think walking away.
For the most part, it's been wonderful to see.
Exactly. So I do, as we close, thank you. This was a delightful Zoom with you and our first online book talk. And I think it turned out pretty well. You were a wonderful and engaging guest, and the topic is terrific and very timely. And wish you and your family all the best, and best to your daughter and her recovery and everything as we begin to resume whatever passed for normal previously.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you and the library system and the County of Arlington. I have to say that one of my goals was always to have a one county, one book. And so while it's disappointing, of course, that we can't be there, I'm very happy, and I'm really grateful to be doing it now at this time in this way, however we can. I think it's just wonderful. And I hope that the county has lots of conversations virtually about it, and finds ways to talk about the presidency in our country. And, you know, I didn't expect it to be this timely, but my goodness, it is. So everyone stay well and stay safe.
Yes, it's going to open up all kinds of conversations, and that's our purpose anyway, both as librarians and as people who are interested in history and books. And so thank you very much for giving of your time this afternoon, and stay safe and stay hopeful.